We are taught a very specific historical narrative about the 1930s. We hear that a dictator took control of a broken nation and magically fixed the economy. We see archival footage of newly built highways and factories operating at full capacity. People look back at this era and claim that despite the atrocities, the regime knew how to build wealth. But the numbers in the historical ledger tell a completely different story. The Third Reich did not build a functional, sustainable economy. They did not invent a new system of economic growth. They built a state-sponsored Ponzi scheme. They funded their military machine through extreme financial deception, state-sponsored theft, and the systematic plundering of conquered nations because their economy relied entirely on hidden debt. Going to war was not simply an ideological goal. It was a strict financial necessity to avoid total national bankruptcy. Today, we look at the dark math of the Nazi economy. We examine the creation of phantom money through shell companies. We trace the liquidation of wealth through legalized theft. We expose the corporate beneficiaries who use slave labor to build their global brands. And we explain how the invasion of Europe operated as a desperate attempt to pay off maturing debt. Welcome back to Money's Hidden Past, where we examine the underlying structures of the global economy. Today, we investigate the financial accounting of the Third Reich. But before we open the ledger, please hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below, and let me know if you were ever taught the actual economics of this era in school. Your support helps this channel reach people who need to hear these stories, to understand the financial trap the regime built. You have to look at the starting point in the early 1930s. Germany suffered under the weight of the Great Depression and the reparations from the First World War. Unemployment skyrocketed and the currency faced severe instability. When the Nazi Party took power, they made a simple promise to the working class. They promised jobs and bread. They launched massive public works projects like the Autobahn highway system. They put millions of men to work building roads, bridges, and government buildings. The unemployment rate dropped, and the public believed the economy was healing. But building highways does not generate a return on investment fast enough to fund a massive state apparatus. And the regime did not just want highways, they wanted to rebuild the military. The Treaty of Versailles strictly prohibited Germany from building a massive army. So the government needed to fund the production of tanks, airplanes, and munitions secretly. They faced a mathematical wall. They did not have the tax revenue to pay for the weapons. If they printed cash to pay for the weapons, they would trigger hyperinflation and destroy the currency. If they issued public government bonds, the international community would see the debt and realize they were rearming. They needed a way to borrow billions of marks invisibly. The president of the central bank, a man named Hjalmar Schacht, engineered a solution. He created a financial instrument that operated as pure phantom money. The government established a fake shell company called the Metallurgical Research Corporation. The German acronym for this fake company was MEFO. MEFO possessed no actual factories, no employees, and no physical assets. It existed only as a legal entity on a piece of paper with a starting capital of just 1 million marks. When the government ordered a fleet of tanks from a real manufacturer like Krupp or Siemens, the government did not pay the manufacturer with cash. Instead, the fake shell company MEFO issued an IOU to the manufacturer. These IOS became known as MEFO bills. The MEFO bill functioned as a promise to pay the manufacturer the full amount plus interest 5 years in the future. The central bank guaranteed the bills, meaning the manufacturers trusted the paper. When a manufacturer received a MEFO bill, they could hold it to collect the interest, or they could trade it to another company to buy raw materials. The MEFO bills began to circulate among German corporations as a shadow currency. This accounting trick solved multiple problems for the regime simultaneously. First, it kept the military debt completely off the national books. If a foreign diplomat or a citizen looked at the official government budget, they saw a balanced ledger. The billions of marks spent on weapons remained hidden inside the fake shell company. Second, it allowed the government to spend money it did not possess without triggering immediate inflation because the MEFO bills circulated only among large corporations and never reached the hands of the working class. The consumer market did not see a flood of new cash. The price of bread and milk remained stable, while the shadow economy funded the war machine. Between 1934 and 1938, the MEFO system generated 12 billion marks of secret debt. To put that number in perspective, 12 billion marks represented roughly half of the entire national budget. The state built the most advanced military in the world using a credit card hidden in a fake name. But the shadow currency only delayed the inevitable math. Every Ponzi scheme eventually runs out of new capital. The MEFO bills carried a 5-year maturity date. The government promised to exchange the paper bills for real cash when the 5 years expired. As the clock ticked toward 1938 and 1939, the early bills started coming due. The corporations knocked on the door of the central bank demanding their money. The government looked in the treasury and found it empty. They had spent all their real tax revenue on domestic programs and fixed costs. The regime faced a catastrophic financial cliff. If they defaulted on the MEFO bills, the corporate sector would collapse and the military supply chain would halt. If they printed real cash to pay the bills, they would trigger hyperinflation and destroy the savings of the working class. They needed an immediate massive injection of physical capital to plug the hole in the ledger. They found this capital through the systematic liquidation of targeted populations. This brings us to the second pillar of the Nazi economy, state-sponsored theft. The regime passed a series of laws designed to exclude Jewish citizens from the economy. History books often focus on the ideological hatred driving these laws, but they frequently overlook the cold financial utility. The regime weaponized the legal code to strip assets from a specific demographic and transfer that wealth directly into the state treasury. They called this process Aryanization. The state forced Jewish business owners to sell their factories, retail stores, and corporate shares. They did not allow the owners to sell the assets at fair market value. The government dictated the terms, forcing the owners to sell at a fraction of the real worth. Loyal party members and non-Jewish citizens purchased these businesses for pennies on the dollar. This transferred massive amounts of physical equity to the supporters of the regime, securing their political loyalty through financial enrichment. But the state did not let the targeted citizens keep the fraction of money they received from the forced sales. The government instituted a labyrinth of financial traps. They imposed a flight tax on anyone attempting to leave the country. If a family tried to flee, they had to surrender a massive percentage of their total net worth to the government border agents. The state froze bank accounts, they confiscated physical gold, they stole artwork, and they seized real estate. They auctioned off the stolen furniture and personal belongings to the general public. The revenue from these state-sponsored thefts flowed directly into the national treasury. The regime literally paid its bills by cannibalizing its own citizens. The state acted as a predatory entity, liquidating the wealth of a minority to subsidize the majority and hide the mounting debt of the military machine. The financial architecture of the regime relied heavily on the cooperation of the private sector. This brings us to the corporate beneficiaries of the system. Many massive globally recognized companies today profited directly from the economic policies of the Third Reich. The regime did not nationalize the entire economy like the Soviet Union. Instead, they formed a highly lucrative partnership with private corporations. The state provided the contracts, the raw materials, and eventually the labor. The corporations provided the manufacturing capacity. Take Volkswagen, for example. The state created the concept of the people's car, a vehicle every working-class family could afford. The government collected millions of marks in advance payments from citizens saving up to buy a car. But the factories did not produce cars for the citizens. They produced military vehicles for the army. Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of the Porsche brand, designed tanks and weapon systems for the military contracts. Hugo Boss, a clothing manufacturer, secured contracts to produce the uniforms for the SS, the Hitler Youth, and the armed forces. As the economy shifted entirely toward war production, the civilian labor force shrank. The military drafted millions of able-bodied men out of the factories and sent them to the front lines. This created a severe labor shortage for the corporations. The regime solved this problem by providing the corporations with slave labor. The state supplied millions of prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and forced laborers from conquered territories to the private factories. Companies like IG, Farben-Krupp, and Siemens built manufacturing plants directly adjacent to the camps. The corporations paid the state a small fee to lease the human beings. The laborers received no wages. They worked under lethal conditions, and the state replaced them when they died. This arrangement allowed the corporations to eliminate their labor costs and achieve massive profit margins. The companies accepted the slave labor because it optimized their balance sheets. The regime monetized human life to keep the industrial supply chain moving. The private sector willingly integrated into the machinery of exploitation because the financial incentives aligned with their corporate growth. By the beginning of 1939, the internal mechanics of the Ponzi scheme began to fail. The theft of domestic assets could no longer cover the massive structural deficit. The MEFO bills matured faster than the state could steal money from its own citizens. The central bank warned Hitler that the state faced imminent financial ruin. The government could no longer secure international loans because foreign banks recognized the instability. The regime reached the mathematical end of the road. They had built a massive army on credit, and the bill was due. They possessed only one remaining mechanism to generate capital. They had to expand the borders. They had to take the military they built with phantom money and use it to physically extract wealth from their neighbors. The invasion of Europe was driven by racial ideology and territorial ambition, but it was triggered by a strict accounting deadline. If the army did not march, the economy would collapse within months. When the German army invaded Poland in September 1939, they initiated the final phase of the Ponzi scheme, the plunder of occupied Europe. As the military crossed borders and captured capital cities, they executed a highly organized financial extraction. The first target in every conquered nation was the central bank. Specialized financial units followed the frontline troops when a city fell. These units marched into the national bank vaults and physically removed the gold reserves and foreign currency. They shipped the gold back to Berlin, melting it down and restamping it to hide the origin. They used the stolen gold to buy raw materials from neutral countries like Sweden and Switzerland. Sweden required gold in exchange for iron ore. The Nazi regime paid for the iron ore using the gold they stole from the vaults of Vienna, Prague, and Warsaw, but the plunder extended far beyond the bank vaults. The regime instituted a system of occupation costs. When the army occupied a country like France, the German government declared that the French citizens had to pay for the privilege of being occupied. They forced the defeated governments to pay astronomical daily fees to cover the housing, feeding, and supplying of the German troops. The daily fee imposed on France amounted to 20 million Reichsmarks a day. This fee far exceeded the actual cost of maintaining the army. The surplus capital flowed back into the German economy. The regime forced the conquered nations to fund the continued existence of the German military. The financial engineers in Berlin also manipulated the currency exchange rates. They artificially overvalued the German mark and artificially devalued the currencies of the occupied territories. When German soldiers walked into stores in Paris or Amsterdam, their money possessed massive artificial purchasing power. The soldiers bought food, clothing, consumer goods, and luxury items, stripping the shelves bare. They mailed these goods back to their families in Germany. This influx of stolen consumer goods kept the German home front relatively comfortable during the early years of the war. The government used the wealth of Europe to buy the compliance of the German working class. The citizens ignored the loss of their civil liberties because they experienced a steady flow of imported goods. The regime also weaponized the international clearing accounts. Before the war, European nations traded goods through a centralized clearing system. If Germany bought grain from Romania and Romania bought machinery from Germany, they balanced the ledger at the end of the year and settled the difference. During the war, Germany continued to import raw materials and food from the occupied and allied nations. But they stopped exporting manufactured goods in return. They took the resources and simply recorded the debt in the clearing ledger. They promised to pay the debt after they won the war. By 1944, Germany accumulated massive clearing debts with nearly every nation in Europe. They essentially imported billions of dollars worth of physical goods on credit with absolutely no intention of ever settling the accounts. They drained the agricultural and industrial output of the continent, starving the local populations to feed the industrial center in Berlin. When you aggregate these financial mechanisms, you see the true architecture of the Nazi economy. They operated a system completely devoid of fundamental economic value. They hid the startup costs in a shell company using MEFO bills. They paid the early interest by liquidating the assets of their own citizens through Aryanization. They subsidized corporate profits by eliminating labor costs through slavery, and they attempted to pay off the principal debt by physically looting the central banks and consumer markets of an entire continent. The economy functioned exactly like a predatory criminal syndicate, scaling up to the level of a sovereign state. They required constant violent expansion simply to service the interest on their hidden debt. The moment the military expansion stopped at the borders of Russia and the beaches of Normandy, the financial engine stalled. They could no longer capture new wealth to feed the machine. The debt finally caught up to the production capacity, and the entire structure collapsed under its own weight. We must study the dark math of this era because it teaches a crucial lesson about state power and financial illusion. History often portrays authoritarian regimes as highly efficient machines. We mistake their capacity for violence for a capacity to govern. But the ledger reveals the incompetence hidden behind the propaganda. The regime did not save the German economy. They destroyed it completely. They replaced sustainable trade with extraction. They replaced innovation with theft. They built an illusion of prosperity funded entirely by stolen capital and unpaid bills. Understanding this math changes how we view the historical timeline. The war did not interrupt a functioning economy. The war served as the final desperate act of a bankrupt corporation trying to avoid foreclosure. When a government hides, the numbers manipulates the currency and turns its legal code into an instrument of theft. It does not build strength, it builds a fragile house of cards waiting for the wind. If you found this breakdown of the Nazi economy helpful, please hit that like button right now. It helps this channel grow and tells the algorithm that these honest historical conversations matter. Share this video with a friend who studies history or economics so they can see the math behind the military conflict. We will keep exposing the hidden structures that govern the global economy and dictate the flow of capital throughout history. Until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Stay curious, run your own numbers. And always remember that a state built on theft eventually runs out of victims. Thank you for spending your time with me today, and I will see you in the next video.